so many lines of code I don't even want to think about it. And it worked well for us. The extjs is a web application framework. These are some URLs to the product on the essential.com site and the documentation for the extjs 4.0. There's 2 flavors out right now that's still available. One is 3.x and 4.0 or 4.x. If you're going to use it, I would recommend using 4.x, and for reasons I'll get into in the presentation. The extjs 4, what is it? It's a pure JavaScript application framework. It works in browsers from IE6 to Chrome 11. Provides an application architecture supporting the MVC model view controller pattern. And that MVC is on the client side, it's not on the server side. The extjs application architecture. I'm going to talk about the architecture of the project, and I've got this little warning here because this one bit me royally in the last project I was on. The customer had spent 5 years and many millions of dollars trying to get this one application written for them. So I wrote a proof of concept of how we could do that. And because of the time frames, that proof of concept actually got moved into the application code and built upon and expanded.
That never happens.
No way.
And it ended up with something I'm not 100% satisfied with, and had to refactor a lot of the code that was in there. So if that happens to you, avoid the temptation to do this.
Isn't Agile wonderful?
Of course, that never happened to anybody out there, right?
No.
Certainly not.
Nobody can relate to this.
Okay, good. Glad to hear that. Why use an application architecture? Well, it makes it more scalable, maintainable, flexible, especially if it's a quality architecture. Application architecture is about providing structure and consistency to your project. If you lay out your architecture ahead of time and follow it, it's going to make it more consistent and give you a structure to work with. A good application architecture provides a number of other important benefits. Every application will work the same way. If you write all your applications using this architecture, you only have to learn it once, and it's easier to share code between your applications. You know, if you have another application needs to use something you've done before, if they're both in the same architecture, it's easier to move the code from one to another. The extj4s provides you with a architecture that you can use. I've looked at it; it's pretty good. It provides model view controller. Why an MVC architecture? Large client on-site applications have always been hard to write, hard to organize, and hard to maintain. Tend to quickly grow out of control. The larger they are, the more out of control they go. As you add more functionality and developers to a project. In the last project I was on, this was especially true since we've had resources in India and China. And one group in China decided they were going to do stuff their own way and really messed up everybody else. So if you come up with the architecture document first and make sure everybody follows it, it's going to make your life a lot easier. The ext4js comes with an application architecture that organizes your code and reduces the amount of code you have to write. In the ext4s, the MVC architecture is defined as a model with a collection of fields and their data. Models know how to persist themselves and can be linked together through what they call associations. How many of you here ever used Hibernate? Okay. Hibernate, you can have defined objects that have associations with other objects. Their model is something similar to that. You can have associations within the models, similar to what you have in Hibernate. But it's not an object-oriented database. It goes back to well, it can go back to an object relational database, or it can just go back to a regular relational database. But the model supports associations. You have a view, which is any type of component: grids, trees, panels, forms. Make up your view. And the extjs controller is a place where you put all that code that makes the application tie together and work. If I'm going too fast or you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm actually going to, at the end, show an actual, another prototype I put together to help sell a project, and show you how the controller, the applications all tie in together. In the if you use the extjs4 application architecture, it has a unified directory structure. What I have here is the directory structure of the sample code I was going to show you. You have app, which is a folder that contains all the code for your application. Within app, there's controller, which contains the controllers for the application. A model directory, which contains all the models used by your application. Store, which is all the stores. I'll get into what stores are in a little bit for your application. And then all the views are contained within the view. And the extjs directories contains all the extjs code, of which there's a lot of code there. But if you follow this architecture, you can actually use some build tools that the extjs has to optimize your application so it only has the things that it needs. In the extjs4, with the model, is contained in what they call a data package. Central to this is the model, which has a model, a proxy, and a store. Model will have fields, associations, validations. A proxy will have a reader and a writer. And a store will have functions for doing sorting, filtering, and grouping. Again, a model represents data in the application. It has fields and they have associations and validations. Validations are just code that you put in there to validate the data that's stored into a model before you send it to, before you persist it. A store encapsulates the client-side cache of model objects. Stores load data via a proxy and also provide functions for sorting, filtering, and querying the model instance contained within it. So, and then you have a proxy is used by stores and or models to handle loading and saving of the model data. In other words, persisting that data. The extjs provides proxies that use AJAX, what they call direct, JSONP. Both those are used for cross-domain, accessing cross-domain data. Also local storage and session storage for storing data locally.
Yes. What's the difference between local storage and session storage?
How long it persists. Session storage goes away after your browser session ends. Local storage is there next time you start the browser.
Yeah,
So
session storage. Session storage is usually
HTML5 storage.
Yeah, session is usually cookies, HTML, and local storage is HTML5 local storage.
Well, they're both HTML5 local storage.
Oh, really?
It's just that session storage is where you put stuff that you want to disappear after your session ends.
How does that work with like IE6?
IE6, no. But I actually have written a storage provider that supports IE6 that you could use. But again, you can use AJAX. A version of AJAX called REST, which supports RESTful state data calls. And again, local storage and session storage. I tend to use session storage in my application more because I only want to store that data until the session ends. I use it a lot if I'm implementing the history mechanism that the extjs has. I'll store the data necessary for history in the session storage. Okay, in the extjs view, the extjs core views consist of components. And a typical application hierarchy has the following hierarchy. Usually you'll start an application out with a viewport container. And under there you'll have panels, for example, a tab panel, a regular panel, a form panel, and then form fields and buttons. The extjs also uses containers, which is a type of component, and layouts. Every container has a layout that manages the sizing and positioning of its child components. For example, within a viewport, you'll have a layout that controls how components are laid out within that container. Some of the layouts supplied with the extjs 4 are auto, which is just goes in there as they're given. Border, which divides a viewport into north, south, east, west, and center. Card, which is basically a card format. Column, which lets you have columns within the viewport. Fixed, which is basically you put it in there and it's fixed at that location. H-box, which are horizontal boxes. Table layout, which basically treats it as a table that you put components into. And vertical box, V-box, which gives you a vertical box layout. Within those layouts, for example, V-box and H-box, you can put what they call flex, which will determine how much of the screen that particular object has.
Is that nestable?
What's that?
That nestable?
Yes.
A component that has a layout, which has a table, which has a layout, which...
Well, which you can nest, basically you nest containers, and when I show my sample, I'll have examples of that.
Okay.
But you can nest things within other containers within other containers. So if you have a container that has a V-box layout, each V-box can have its own components or container, and within that you can have additional nesting. There's really no limit to the amount of nesting you can do, other than how much you want your
Download time.
HTML to take. Within the EXT application, there's one main object which is called the application object. Application object is basically a controller that represents any extjs 4 application, which is typically a single page app using a viewport. The EXT app application, that object also acts as the event bus for the application. When you send events, you actually fire the event on the application, and you listen on the application to listen for those events. The EXT application will load and instantiate the controllers used by your application, and it also creates the namespace for your application. Then you have controllers, which are basically the glue that binds everything together. All you really do in a controller is listen to events and take some action based on that event, such as loading a view, loading a store, and so on. Now, if you've ever done any client-server applications before, the old style client-server, this will look probably somewhat familiar. Except now your client is the browser communicating to the server. Controller will provide the following. It will load and instantiate the needed models and stores. for that particular controller. It'll create getters for the needed models and stores. So once it loads and instantiated, it also creates a getter so you can get access to that store via that getter. It will dynamically load required views. The extjs 4 has the capability of dynamically loading the parts of it you need, so that if you only need that part, you can dynamically load it on the map. And it also provides a reference mechanism to create getters for reference views on the page.
So with those dynamically loaded views, if you run that extjs build infrastructure you're talking about, I assume that sort of minifies your source or
What
something,
it
or
does
combines
is it goes through your source, finds out what parts of the extjs you're using, will create a bundle with just those pieces in it and minify it.
Okay, and then depending on what page you hit, it'll download different bundles?
No, for your whole application, it does it for your whole application. So if you have multiple pages in your application, it'll create a bundle that you can deploy that contains all the extjs code that you need for that application, but only the code you need for that application.
Okay.
And when you go to access that page and it needs something, it'll dynamically load it.
Okay, so the bundle isn't one file, it's...
The bundle consists of multiple files.
Okay,
And it's,
all right.
it's something you can deploy.
Okay.
Okay. And again, like I said, it has a reference mechanism to provide getters for any reference views on that page. I haven't used that part yet in the sample, so you won't see an example of it. I probably should go back and do that. Okay, now we'll get to the example application. And what I'll do first is I'll show you the application, which is right here. Hopefully I've been having some problems with the, it did connect to the database this time. Okay, here's a drop down. It's backed by a store that retrieve data from the backend database. When I select the year, it actually goes and accesses the database to get the appropriate values for make, and same thing for the models. All right, if I go and change the year,
Is that doing AJAX calls back to the server to grab those?
it's actually doing REST calls.
Well, okay, you said that's somewhere, I don't know what
That's
REST is.
it's a type of AJAX calls. It is making use of AJAX calls.
Okay.
In fact, if I go here, network, here's the makes, it's called make. It's called REST resources makes. Okay. And what it pulled back was this data. It pulled back a JSON object.
It's an array
of
of
data. It's an array of
hashes, yeah.
It's basically an array of miles, of records.
Yeah, key value type variables,
Yeah.
right?
Got to make description, make syskey, and make bin. So it's making AJAX calls. I changed it to 212. And you can see the list changed. There's no longer in the Oldsmobile.
Daewoo.
Oh, there is Pontiac.
And here. Now when I click next, it's going to fire an event that will bring up the second control I have, which is the publications controller. And hopefully there it goes. We pulled up a view that's a tree view. So we can open up the tree view. And it's making, again, AJAX calls to go and get the data for that tree to populate it.
So is it making that call as you click the plus sign there, it
Yes.
hasn't preloaded that part of it?
Yes.
So most trees are preloaded and just not displayed. at least that I've dealt with.
Well,
much
this,
data.
this one is very dynamic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Based on the model that I select, it's gonna be different.
Mhm.
So everything is, goes back and makes the AJAX call.
Yeah, there'd be an awful lot of data that's sucked down if you're only gonna look at one thing.
And then if I click repair instructions on vehicle, it actually goes out and pulls back a list of repair instructions for that vehicle. And if you notice, the tree collapsed. I can come back and expand it. Or I can click in the bar here and it opens, just comes out and overlays it.
Those are all widgets in extjs.
These are all widgets within the extjs.
What do you need on the server end?
What's that?
What do you need on the server end?
Something to respond to.
Something to respond to it. I'm using Java and Jersey to do the REST processing.
Okay.
But it could be PHP or
It could
Perl or
be
anything.
PHP, it could be whatever, Ruby. It's a back end. As long as it recognizes that I can make the REST calls to it, I don't care what's there.
Okay.
Scope of this presentation is the front end.
Sure.
But
What database is it talking to at the back end?
right now it's talking to Oracle.
Oracle? Okay.
Because I'm actually going against customers'
Yeah,
database.
the GM database or something
Yeah.
like, yeah. Okay.
So it comes up with a list of, and this is a grid panel, with only one column.
Oh, so you could have like put the dates in a separate column on that, had two, it would have been two
Yes.
columns? Yeah.
I could have.
Yeah, just, okay.
Except the application here, they want the data as part of the title. So I did that. And if I go here and select another thing, notice it closed the other tree entry and just opened up the new one. I didn't leave it open because it would just get too large.
But that's your choice as to.
That's my choice. Definitely my choice.
Who's the user of your system here? Is this,
You would just-
mechanics, computers, service managers?
Well, this is a prototype to basically sell, replacing the current system they have, which is a traditional web page. It's one page. Each of these would be a page as you went down through it. So it's basically just, and also selling it right now, there's a database that they have for it. Part of the sell was to go against the actual authoring database directly instead of having a separate database that had to be uploaded every night. And like I say, if I click on home, it takes me back to the home page. Now,
So all those icons at the top are part of your app? That-
yes, they're all part of the app. It's in a static part of the app. That doesn't change. And if you notice something, there's no back or forward buttons and the URL hasn't changed.
Right.
This is all a single page. You know, and here I'm logging some, like Be Home Go event received, that loads a home page. And when I did it down here, it's Be Home event received, so it loaded the page.
Released.
Huh?
You received is spelled backwards.
Oh,
We'll let it slide.
yeah, it's a quick login message. Okay, and what I'll do now is I'll go in and actually show you the application, the code, and give you a quick walkthrough through it. Again, we have this, I use NetBeans IDE, I just happen to like it. Don't like Eclipse, so. Remember I was talking about an application? You have to see the application. In the extjs, you provide configuration items in a object. Then I gave it a name. I told her what the app folder was. It was app, which is that folder that's under the web page there. I told it to auto create the viewport, so I didn't have to add code in here to create it. It's going to create it for me. I told it I have two controllers. Those controllers are main menu and publication. I told it requires this ext detailed history. I'm in the midst of putting history into the, incorporating history into the page, but it wasn't ready in time for the demonstration, and I apologize for that. Got busy with real work. And then it has a launch function. You know, on a lot of DMH web applications, you have to do like a on ready event. When the document loads and it's ready. Well, in extjs you can do that, or you can actually say on launch, and it will execute these when it's ready. I was knitting the history, setting a change event on the history. One thing that they don't do that I wish they did is in the namespace they create for you, which is the name of the given up here. That name is what becomes your application namespace. What they don't do is give you a way to reference your application from within that namespace. Something I wish they do is something I'm going to put in there as a feature request. Reason for that is makes it very. There's times where you want to fire an event on the application. Having that makes it easy to find that application to fire the event on. Okay. So what I do here is I go ahead and store a reference to my application in my namespace. And then the first thing I do is I fire the event at bhomeGo, which basically starts the whole application.
Someplace are you listening for bhomeGo, or is that?
That's where I'm going next.
Okay.
Did you find that NetBeans gave you something to work with the extjs that Eclipse did not? Or,
No, it's just got very good JavaScript support, and I've used it forever. I looked at Eclipse a long time ago, but it required a special this UI library, which I couldn't get on the machine that I was running at that time. While NetBeans just uses straight, pure Java Swing. So I started using it and never stopped. I have no reason to go to Eclipse. And
That's some momentum.
huh?
Certain amount of momentum.
Yes. Okay, and then under the directory I have a controller. I have something called the main menu controller. Can everyone read that okay? Okay. Okay, the extjs also gives you a nice class system for defining classes and extending classes. What I'm doing here is I'm defining a new class called GSI controller main menu. I'm extending the XT app controller class, and it requires these UI items: header panel, publication field set, and home panel. So those are all views that this controller is going to preload for me. I'm requiring these stores, which is the model years store, the makes store, and the model store. And I'm requiring these models: model year, make, and model. What I do is that I tend to, if models are singular, and stores I just name as plural. Just a convention I have. They have an init function for init that gets called when it's instantiated. And what I'm doing is this .application on. I'm defining listeners now. Here I have the bhomeGo event that was fired that I'm listening for. It comes in here. It gets the viewport. What's that?
There's your typo.
Yeah, there's my typo.
No, you got the V and the C.
The V and the C, yeah, too. Easier to start over.
Okay. And if I go back and refresh the page, that will be this. What I do is I get the viewport, and what I do is I look at the viewport to see what items it has. And if it has any items, I go ahead and destroy those items. So that by doing that, I'm releasing memory that was taken up by those previous items. So my memory footprint ends up being smaller. It means I have to refresh the DOM every time I go back to the page or go to the other page, but it still works pretty fast.
You find you're in Chrome right now. Do you find like Chrome is it Chrome? Still perform nicely in IE and
Yes, it still performs the same in IE and Firefox. It's just that I don't have the good enough tools in IE. And
again, the debugger
it leaves something to be desired. Development tools leave something to be desired. Okay, and then I'm going to add to my viewport some components. Okay, first thing I'm adding is a panel. I'm giving it an ID, so it can be found by using get component, like I did up here. Get component will look through the DOM and find a component with that ID and return a reference to it. It has no, I'm turning borders to 0, turning borders off. It's going to have a layout of VBox. The line is stretched. That just means it takes up the whole. Stretch means it takes up the whole width or whatever's available. It's got a flex of 1. And within that panel, I'm going to have a publication field set. And it's just an X type. So when I'll show you the view for publication, that's all defined in a different file. Next time I'm not taking it so far. Okay. And then I'm also applying a GSI home panel. And when that's loaded, I have listeners, and after it's been rendered, which means after it's been put on the screen and it's been entered into the DOM, it's going to go through and for each of those icons on the top, attach a listener. And the listener is just going to be the ID that was given that icon plus the word go. So that's where Be Home Go came from. And there's also listeners. None of them right now do anything except log. Except for model year selected. If the model year selected, it goes through, gets the model year that was selected, and makes the call to go get the makes. Make selected, goes and gets the stuff needed to load the makes. And when model is selected, it enables that button that says next on the application. But these are all listeners that events get fired on. There's also a reset button, so when that gets pressed, it goes through and resets everything. Okay, so that's the make controller. Let me go now into the view for these. You have a GSI header panel, which is basically a class that extends a panel. It assigns an alias, this alias being widget.GSI header panel. What that does is that allows me to use that X type and give it the GSI header panel, and it will use this class. So basically I'm defining a widget that as a reference, so I can use it in the next slide. Here, it's H box with a line stretch. And it comes in through here, finds a container. And this is that service information label at the top. So there's a whole bunch of other ones here. Let me get down to where I have something more interesting to show you. And basically that's it on this panel. It just defines that in the icons. Okay, the listeners are defining those icons in that controller on when that's rendered. Something more interesting to look at would be this one, which is basically the form for entering in the year, make, model. Has a container, it has a bin form, layout is HBox. Then you have a display field, and that's just the text of view the publication, blah, 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 then click next. It has another container, which is the actual field, text field, again with the next type. It gives it a label, a width, an ID. Label style, a bold, which basically bolds the bin. Then I have another one that's just a spacer to give it, so it doesn't go all the way to the end of the screen.
So these definitions are actually a combination of what you would call CSS stuff and HTML field definitions?
It's mostly defining components within extjs, which end up being CSS and HTML form and field definitions.
I mean, because this is kind of just mixing the style with the definition.
Well, it kind of does here, but I'm just styling the label. You don't have to. I could have created a CSS entry for that, but since it only applies to this label, that's all I applied it to. It's your choice. Okay. Yes.
Does extjs support any sort of templating?
Yes.
Okay. Is that something you would use?
It's something you could use. I didn't in this.
Okay. And you would use it with views?
Yeah.
Okay.
They have a very good templating system. So it works out rather well. I just didn't use it for this app because I'm just defining individual fields. There weren't many of them. You use templates if you're doing a lot of repetitive things. I think internally, like grid, we use a template for the grid. I have another container where I define the year, make, models. I associate a store with them. I tell it the label where to align the labels. You can align the labels at top, left, or right. You can give a style to the labels if you want. Usually I just do font weight bold. Right in the field definition, it's just easier for me that way. For select will basically by turning that on, you're telling it that for the drop down, you have to select something in the drop down. You just can't enter a value. If that was false, you can enter in something else besides what was in the drop down. But I'm saying you got to choose something in the drop down. And I have the listener with select. I go ahead and fire the event. Model year selected. And passes the three combos that were defined, just so I have easy reference to them in my event memo. Same thing with make fields. Same thing with model fields. Then I have another container that has the buttons. This button will this button fires the select publications, which goes to another controller, which loads up the tree. And then you have a reset button, which fires the event reset publication. But again, the controllers, again, here's the publication controller. You know, you define your controller. It can require views, so it will preload those views for you, dynamically load them. That's done with the requires configuration item. You'll preload your stores. That's done in the stores. And it'll preload your models. In addition, it will supply you getters for the stores and models. If I want a reference to, if I want a getter for the view, I'm going to have to put in a reference, which I don't have here. And again, the init function, all it does is it's apply some listeners to the application. Again, the application works as your event bus. All your events are there and are fired there and listened for there. Again, I remove everything from the report and then load my views. One view is the grid panel, which is what's showed the document list. I didn't have to do that. I could have had the document list in the tree, but I wanted to show a grid too, so I put it in the grid. It has an ID, and this one has a region because layout is border. Like I said earlier, border that splits your report into north, south, east, west, and center. And if you're using border layout, you have to have a center. If you don't have a center, it's not going to work. Begin there. And then we have the tree panel, which is in the west region. I have a title, which is the options title, which the options were passed in. It has a root. Root is expanded. And I also have something where I don't actually show the root. But, and then you have listeners. I listen on the before expand, before item expand, and before item collapse. And I'll fire events when those happen. That's what's going to go and remove the previous entries on that one, and it collapses it, so you're not in memory anymore. And the other one is what goes and gets the data.
So if somebody had expanded one, and then they expanded another, you collapsed the first one.
Yes.
Did you also throw away that data, so if they go and re-expanded you're going back to the server this
Yes,
time for the
I did.
data?
You don't have to, but I did. And the reason again is to lower memory usage. And then I get the document tree panel and I expand it. And here's where I get a reference to my publication store by using the getter that was automatically created by extjs. I didn't write the code to do the get publication store function. The extjs provided it for me. Then I load the initial data and I have a callback load tree used. And again, use the low tree root. Basically what it does is it adds nodes to that tree. I don't, in fact, here's the code that I had in there to display the document list as part of the tree. Just commented on it. But, and then what I do instead is I get the reference to the grid. I get the path and substring it to return just what is in the, so I can put a title up there. I show the grid. I remove everything that was in that store before, which removes everything from the grid. And then I load it using the following parameters, which is, I give it the vehicle, publication, section, subsection, and the delivery stick, that's service info type. It goes out, makes a call, returns the data, loads it into the store, and automatically displays it in the grid. And then last thing I do is I collapse the tree. But again, the controller is where you listen to all the events and do the logic for your program. Now there's a lot of code here and probably gets pretty boring. It's me going through it, but and then I have the low tree root, which loads the root tree, and then I have the collapse child, which removes the data from the previously open one.
Is this a demonstration project that you, or is this a live thing that's up?
It's a prototype project for trying to sell some business to our customer.
Okay. And did you write this all yourself, or was this a team?
This I wrote all myself in about a day or two.
This is 2 days worth of 3 days.
2 to 3 days, but spread over a number of weeks because I only spent a few hours.
You've done a lot of this kind of stuff though, right? So
Yes.
It comes pretty easy with it.
Well, I'm learning. I'm very knowledgeable on the extjs 3.
Yeah.
The extjs 4 is a whole new animal. So basically, one of the reasons I did this was to learn the extjs 4. And I wish we had the extjs 4 on our last project. It would have made it so much simpler.
So is that the way of the future, or are they just different animals? Is 4, I mean, is that their future, and 3 is
Yes.
going to die up?
They do some maintenance on 3 because a lot of people still use it. But they're saying if you're starting a new project, use 4. Okay.
Have you done any work in other frameworks like Dojo or jQuery or?
I've looked at Dojo. I've looked at, there was one Sun had that was basically a framework that used a lot of different frameworks underneath it. I forget what they call it. I've done some stuff with jQuery. This has a large number of widgets available to it. A lot of user contributed widgets. Some of the user contributed widgets actually became part of the framework. There was one that they called row editor. So if you have a grid, you can click on a row and it opens up an editor just on that row, so you can go in and change values and save it. That was initially an extension, is now part of the framework.
What's the license for extjs?
It's dual license. It's both GPL and commercial. If you go out to the site, usually the GPL version is at least a version behind, but every once in a while they'll get in sync. Okay. For example, EXT 4.07 is available for both commercial and GPL. That's the latest one. Basically, the thing with the commercial license is support. Commercial support for it. which in my case, we have the commercial license because it's a requirement of our customer.
And how often do you use their support?
When I was initially starting, we used it a lot.
Okay.
After about halfway through the project, not so much.
Yeah. Okay. So you have
Basically, I was level 1 support. If I couldn't figure it out,
Alright.
we went to extjs.
You got a widget gallery or anything to show us?
Yes,
show us?
I can go there. This is their documentation page. It's actually quite good. There's a bunch of guides, overviews, concepts, so on and so forth. Here's their examples. They have one called Web Desktop.
This website itself an example of the extjs?
Yes, the website itself is an example of the
I would hope so.
No, they actually wrote it in Dojo. I'm kidding.
No, it might be a combination of other things too, right?
What's that?
It could be a combination of other things too, I suppose.
Possibly, but it's actually just, it's all written in extjs.
Have you worked in any of the other frameworks professionally? Have you done a commercial sized project?
No. No. You know, you can open up a grid window here.
And for browser support, are you finding that you have to debug for each of the browsers, or when it works in one, are you finding it works in the others? Or?
Yes. Initially, we had some issues with the extj with IE6, but I don't worry about IE6 anymore because our client is now pushing on
All the way up to 7.
7, and I think they're going to go up to 8 soon.
But Firefox and Safari and
Yeah. I haven't tested it in Safari,
If it works in Chrome, it should work.
but it works well in Chrome. It works in Firefox. It actually works in IE fairly well. I had some initial problems with IE6, like I said, that I was able to get around, work around.
do they do anything at all with the handheld devices, the iPads, the iPhones, the Android?
Well, now that you
extend
mention
into that
it.
world at all?
Yes. They have a product called Touch. I haven't used it, so all I can tell you is what they have. Go to Products, Sensor Touch is HTML5 mobile web app framework. Okay. Again, I'm not here to sell Sentra, so I'm just letting you know it's there.
And so, I mean, would that mean that your application would work on both? Or, I mean, it's a much smaller
Develop it
screen,
separately,
so.
A lot of the things I could probably use, but there probably might be some things I have to make. I can't tell you for sure because I've never done anything with Touch. I do know that what's in Touch is in extjs, but I don't know if the reverse is true. Okay, any other questions? They do have an active community and with forums. So there's some forums that you have to be, have the commercial support to get into, but there's a whole bunch of community forums also. And you can usually post a question there and get an answer relatively quickly. Again, like I'm saying, if you're thinking about using the extjs form, I would recommend using, or extjs, I would recommend using 4. You do not have to use the framework. You can just, if you want, just pull widgets that you need to put onto your existing web pages. They have customers that have done that. And you can access the widgets that way. I do like, probably the best thing I like about it is their data system with stores and models, and the AJAX calls to go get data.
With those models, do you have to define your model properties on both the client side and server side, or can the client side pick it up from the server?
That's what I forgot to show you. Thank you for that question. I'll show you an example model. Okay. Let's go with the publication model. You notice here I have a name and I also have a mapping. The mapping is what's returned from the client. If you don't have, if their name is the same, you can just put the name in there. You don't need the mapping. It knows enough to get it. So, for example, here, publication name, I have that. Just put that as the name because that's all that's needed. But I wanted to have title or syskey a reference called syskey because all my models will use syskey. But what's returned from the database is different. It'll be publication syskey, publication section syskey, and so forth. Well, this gives me a way of renaming what gets sent from the server. Another thing that you can do is you can have a convert function. If you need to do some special formatting for your data. Here I have a name called title, and it has a convert function, which basically gets the status from the current record, and if the status is a particular is not equal to 1, in other words, it's a work in progress, or if it's not equal to 1 being a work in progress, it puts nothing there. Otherwise, it puts a work in progress indicator in front of it. Okay. And then it adds on the publication name.
Is there more rich types? Can you do like date?
You can do integer. It's in the documentation. I've used one called time before, which is a.
Is it a time picker or?
Well, they do have a time picker, but time as a type in a model is the milliseconds since whatever. But you can have int, string, auto, which is basically anything. It doesn't do anything with the data. Int, it will actually parse it for you and give the value will actually be an integer. It's object.
But if they try to type a character in, does it stop them, or
You can do that with validations. I don't have any validations here because it's all read-only. But you can add validations. If you go to the documentation site, like I said, the documentation is rather good. There's a couple gotchas in there that need to be fixed yet, but on the whole, I was able to do that. One of the gotchas that wasn't clear was whether you had to put in the full class name or just the name without the namespace. Some places you do, like for requires, you have to put the full class name, but other places you don't.
So is this then defined a JSON object which your server side is returning to you?
Yes.
Is that what it's done?
Well, I have a reader, which is a JSON. They have different readers for different things. They have an XML reader, so you can return XML. They have a JSON reader, so you can return JSON. I tend to only return JSON. I don't bother with XML. Okay?
I agree.
So if I have my druthers, it's JSON, and if I have to fight for it, I will. but it will support XML. So your customer absolutely says, or if you're reading from a source that only returns XML, you can use an XML reader. Okay, see, and here's the proxy for this model. Type is REST. URL, resource/publications. Type is JSON, which basically means this is a JSON reader. And you give it the ID property, which is basically your syskey. And we also have to give it a root, because if we look at what's returned, do I still have that under that? Oh, no, I don't. So if I go back here, go to network, look at model years, if I look at the response, you'll see it has something called success, which is true. If for some reason the server call failed, you could success false and it will handle the error. You can program your error handling based on that. I have a count, which is how many records were returned, any error message that was returned, and data. Data being the root of the data that's sent back from the server. So here you have data, and it contains all, it's an array of all the models that we, objects that we return. And that's why you have to say root is data, so it knows where in the returned object it gets the data it needs. So that's a model. If you're using models and you find your proxy in the models, your stores become very, very simple. Here's my publication store. I actually find some grouper in here. So a group of data that's displayed. But basically, I'm telling it not to load it, not to sort unload. I give it a store ID and a model. And if I look at year make model, which is probably
Confusing is you've got the word model throughout your application, and there's the model as an NPC.
yes,
Yeah.
well, the models are implemented by those models.
I understand.
Okay.
When I say model, we're not sure what you're talking about.
This model refers to the model that defines the fields. But it becomes very simple, my sort becomes very simple. And by setting auto load true, when it actually instantiates this data store, it makes the call automatically.